We've spent our whole life trying to unite the world, and I'm tired, dude.
Ted, we have a destiny to fulfill.
Do you know what you want? You don't know for sure. Don't feel bad. You can't find a cure. But are you getting less than what you're looking for? This can only mean one thing. It's my review of Bill and Ted's Face the Music. 29 years after the last time we saw a theatrical release from Bill and Ted, and the question in everyone's mind is, was it an excellent adventure, or was it a bogus journey? Not to be a reflection on the quality of those previous two films, it's just a great way of kind of defining if it was bad or good or not. Bill and Ted are one of the great duos in cinema history. They're up there with Wayne and Garth, but they're there with Riggs and Murtaugh, Batman and Robin, Thelma and Louise. They started off as cult classics, and through word of mouth and generous reshowings on television, after 29 years Bill and Ted are as famous as they ever were. So a little bit of background about the first two movies. The first one had George Carlin's Rufus send a phone booth to Bill and Ted at San Dimas High School so that they could pass their history exam. If not, Ted was going to be sent to military school, which would mean that their band, the Wild Stallions, wouldn't be able to perform to create the song that would unite the world in harmony. The second film was about when an evil Joss Ackland sent evil robot versions of Bill and Ted back in time to kill themselves in order to forge history to his own liking. The last thing that we saw from Bill and Ted was when they travelled to the future in order to learn the song that would unite the world, beating out Primus at the San Dimas Battle of the Bands for a prize of... I don't know if they said what the prize was, but ultimately they played a song and we assumed that was going to be the harmony that saved all of reality and time. And if it wasn't that, it was going to be the cover by Kiss of God Gave Rock and Roll to You Too. This movie suggests that neither of those songs were the song that saved humanity, and instead it has taken them 25 years to get to this point where they are really put under the screw in order to come up with this song at long last. Keanu Reeves was seemingly asked in pretty much every interview he's had over the last decade or so what's happening with Bill and Ted 3, and his response was always, it's in the works, to the point where it almost felt like he was trolling us. Even Alex Winter suggested that he's having fun at the expense of fans, but here it is. Like Deadpool, the fans wished it so, and it became so. So, here it is. Bill and Ted are back in 2020 in the midst of a global pandemic, which is obviously going to destroy their box office, which is sad. The previous film's subtitles kind of suggested the type of voyage that they were going to have. Bogus Journey, Excellent Adventure, and in this case maybe the film should have been called Bill and Ted's Harmless Excursion. So comedy films have a bad track record when it comes to belated sequels. You look at your Anchorman, your Zoolander, your Dumb and Dumber, none of them quite met the mark, not living up to fan expectations, not being as funny as the previous ones. Sci-fi films are often a bit of a tonal mess or a storyline mess. You look at the Star Warses, you look at the Terminators, apart from saying, hey look, characters are back. So this film is a mix of comedy and sci-fi, so it had its work cut out to begin with. The worst thing that a sequel or follow-up or prequel, sidequel, spin-off could do is to sully the name of its other members of the franchise. Keanu Reeves knows this a little more than others, with the last half an hour of Matrix Reloaded following into Matrix Revolutions, where it kind of made people not like the original Matrix as much because of the sour taste that they had from the previous experience. So what you want to do is you want to avoid making this movie make the other films feel invalid or redundant. Thankfully, Bill and Ted Face the Music doesn't do that. It flirts a little bit with the idea that it was the daughters of Bill and Ted that end up being the musicians of legend, but ultimately they just settle for a writing credit when it comes to this Omega song. So let's start with the casting. There's plenty of old faces back, and man, does some of them look old. an internet meme was that Keanu Reeves hasn't aged in the last 30 years, but unfortunately I think we kind of have to lay that meme to rest right now, because without the beard, his age is showing pretty well. When it comes to Alex Winter, he kind of slides straight back into the role of Bill S. Preston Esquire, and it feels like Keanu Reeves' Ted Theodore Logan has a little bit more of trying to match the pace, trying to mimic his previous performance. It's not as natural as we'd like it to be, but maybe it's because we've seen Keanu Reeves in so many other films of different genres in the past. And William Sadler is back as well as Death, criminally underutilised, unfortunately. He's only in it very briefly up until the end of the movie, and it's a shame for such a breakout performance of the Bogus journey. In terms of new faces, George Carlin obviously couldn't return since he's been dead for 18 years, so instead they have Kirsten Shaw playing as his daughter, the character Rufus's daughter. Kirsten Shaw doesn't carry the coolness or the suaveness of George Carlin's Rufus, unfortunately, and at the same time we're used to Kirsten Shaw playing as these kind of like space princessy kind of wacky characters, and she doesn't lean into that either, so maybe it's more of an audience expectation of what we want from Kirsten Shaw, but she doesn't tend to fall into either of those categories, which is kind of almost jarring, I'd say. Two of the new characters, key characters, are the daughters of Bill and Ted in the Bogus journey. We assume when the two babies on their back were Lil Bill and Lil Ted, we assume they were boys. Turns out that they were actually girls. Wilhelmina is played by Bridget Lundy Payne, and Theodora is played by Samara Weaving from the underrated horror comedy The Babysitter. They do okay, but it seems more like an impression of the old Bill and Ted, not as natural, since we are no longer in the heyday of heavy metal from when the first two movies were set. Anthony Carrigan plays as an assassin robot sent to kill Bill and Ted in a plotline that makes no sense, and it's strange because he initially plays a character that's sincerely a threat, a villain like a mix between the Terminator and Freezer. But he ultimately ends up devolving into a character that's a running joke that doesn't have a punchline. Next up is the look of the movie, which isn't that great. Obviously going from the film that was the previous two were recorded onto digital, there is that kind of jumping quality that is a little jarring. Again, the green screen is unfortunately in full effect with this one. The characters do return to hell, and looking back at Bogus Journey's version of hell, it was a masterclass in creating this nightmarish atmosphere of the afterlife. This movie looks a little bit more Little Nicky-ish, but without the effort of practical effects that Little Nicky did put into it. The time travel sequences from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure were another highlight of the previous films, going from beautiful set piece throughout history, back and forth. It was amazing to look at, and this one, it just seems to be empty rooms after empty rooms. So how about the story itself? Well, after having a most excellent adventure through time, going all around the afterlife, it would be interesting to see where Bill and Ted take their next adventure. Personally, I would have liked if they went through the multiverse, which would have been a really interesting idea, seeing what Bill and Ted seem like through the eyes of different genres maybe, but instead they kind of flirt with the idea where they are mostly going to the future to meet a future version of themselves, which they set up a kind of dull rivalry that's almost cartoonish, but not in the fun Bill and Ted cartoonish kind of way, more of a Hanna-Barbera silly kind of way, to the point where the older version of Bill is trying to shoot the younger version of Bill, which anyone who's seen Red Dwarf knows that if you kill the younger version of yourself, you obliterate the older self from history. Doesn't make sense, does it? The main complaint about the story is that it feels extremely rushed. The previous films had that kind of stoner comedy attitude where they just kind of lackadaisically go about their adventure, even when they're dead trying to escape from hell. They can just kind of go at a nice pace. Whereas this one, they just seem to be like go, go, go to the next set piece, which doesn't really feel as fun. The idea that they, apropos of nothing, have to save reality, which is for no explainable reason falling apart the year that this is happening, just adds that sense of urgency, but not at the same time, because we're trained as an audience to know they're going to pull it off at the end. So adding these extra stakes beyond just the more Bill and Ted-ish personal stakes just seems kind of out of nowhere. The interesting callback is that reality works on the San Dimas time, which is kind of a reference to the first one, and they kind of time this movie almost like 24, where they basically have the runtime of the movie to find this ultimate song and save reality. Don't forget to wind your watch. Example of how it tries to lean on its own success whilst also rushing is when the two daughters go back in time to create this super group of musicians, where you'll only really know 3 of them, and none of those have the energy, the charisma of the previous versions. Try to give Mozart extra personality, but yeah, he was no Beethoven. The BS stakes of this movie further get confused with the idea that Bill and Ted need to save reality within a space of time, because when they get to this point, in like 77 minutes, reality is going to crumble, disintegrate, fall into itself, whatever, but they are able to travel through time to the future to try and get the song from future versions of themselves. So why is it that reality is falling apart now, when clearly they do make the song at some point? So why the rush to do it at this point in time, when down here they do make it? That's never explained. Again, it's just a way to make false stakes for the movie. It is great to see Bill and Ted together again though. I mean, as with all belated sequels, the problem is why is it taken so long? The idea of them not living up to their potential is a fair kind of standpoint to make the movie come from, but we just kind of feel a little bad that their adventures seem to have stopped at the end of the last movie and only really picked up right now again. So I'd say Bill and Ted Face the Music is inoffensive in the pantheon of belated sequels, and looking at the ranks of belated sequels, that can only be seen as a plus. Unfortunately, because it doesn't have the charm or the ham-fisted elegance of the previous films, it doesn't follow that replay value. So with COVID basically destroying the box office chances of Bill and Ted, this is probably the final hurrah for the characters of Bill S. Preston Esquire and Ted Theodore Logan, the wild stallions. And I suppose that because of its inoffensive nature, their legacy does remain intact. The movie does go by quite smoothly. It's not too offensive if you can look past some of the glaring mistakes and issues of why the things are happening the way that they are happening. You just kind of wish they were maybe doing something else. This film does have that kind of straight to internet kind of feeling. It's kind of like, I don't know, I don't want to compare it to Cobra Kai, because Cobra Kai is a lot better than this, unfortunately. So on the sliding scale of excellent adventure to Bogus journey, I would say this is a they, Melv and me point station. Take that for whatever that means. And you could say that this movie isn't non-heinous. So, see you in the next video, and party on, dudes!